They called us ghosts. I know because I read the transcripts. Part of the job, technically scrubbing sensitive imagery from the Hegemony survey data before it got packaged and shipped back to the home clusters for broadcast. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. I sat in a repurposed shipping container on the west edge of what used to be called Parkdale, and I went frame by frame through a billion images of Earth, flagging anything the licensing bureau had flagged, erasing it, moving on. Corporate logos mostly. Product labels. Anything that might constitute an intellectual property violation under Compact Article 44C, which the Hegemony had signed on our behalf without asking us, and which we had no power to contest. But the transcripts came through on the same feed. Audio from the survey drones, captured ambient sound, tagged and timestamped and waiting for localization before broadcast. And in those transcripts, in the Hegemony's own phonetic rendering of their name for us, the word translated cleanly. Ghosts. Not because we were dead, because to them we were something between irrelevant and inexplicable, a pale biological anomaly that had somehow failed to evolve correctly, too slow, too fragile, too emotionally unstable, too irrational in our decision-making to ever amount to a serious civilization. We had reached for the stars once, they noted in their cultural briefings. Briefly. And then we had stopped, turned inward, argued ourselves into paralysis. And by the time the Hegemony's survey ships arrived in our system 40 years ago, we were burning our own cities over debt instruments. They hadn't conquered us. That's the part people always get wrong when they tell the story now. There was no war, no fleet overhead, no boots on the ground. They had simply arrived, catalogued us, assessed us as a Category 4 pre-collapse species, stable enough to exploit, unstable enough to manage cheaply, and filed the paperwork. Within a decade, Hegemony labor contracts were the only steady employment in most of North America and Western Europe. Within 2 decades, the contracts were the economy. The work wasn't glamorous. It was never meant to be. It was designed to be exactly visible enough to keep us functional and exactly degrading enough to keep us grateful. They called us ghosts, and they filmed us, and they sent the footage home. The show was called Window on the World. I know that too from the transcripts. A weekly broadcast across 11 home cluster systems, a cultural curiosity program about the strange, backward species on the third rock of a minor yellow star. We were, apparently, enormously popular, not because we were admirable, because we were funny. Because we kept finding ways to survive things we weren't supposed to survive, kept inventing workarounds for indignities that should have broken us, kept making each other laugh in circumstances that their behavioral models said should have produced only despair. I didn't know any of this when I took the job. I just needed the work. My name is Oscar Velt. In 2040, when I was 34 years old, former network technician, 2 years out of the last steady employment I'd had before the telco consolidation wiped out every independent ISP on the continent. I had a room in a converted warehouse on Roncesvalles, a meal voucher account that cleared twice a week, and a debt to the Hegemony labor registry that I had been making payments on since I was 19 and that had, through compound interest mechanisms I did not fully understand and had not consented to, nearly doubled since then. The digital janitor posting had come through the registry like everything else. The listing was sparse, visual data processing, requires fine motor attention, sedentary, no Hegemony language required, compensation in standard labor credits. I applied because I had applied for everything. I was called back inside 4 hours, which surprised me. The interview was a reaction time test administered by a drone that smelled faintly of ammonia and regarded me with what I had learned to recognize as Hegemony mild contempt. A specific angle of the sensory cluster, a slight slowing of their vocalizer, the way you might speak to a large and marginally house-trained animal. I passed the test. I was given a transit chit to the container site. I was handed a workstation, a headset, and a manual that had been translated from Hegemony script into English by software that had clearly never spoken to a human being. The first paragraph of the manual read, "Congratulations on your selection for visual sanitation labor. Your compliance assists the Hegemony Broadcasting Compact in the delivery of culturally appropriate content to Hegemony audiences. Please understand that all imagery you encounter in the course of your duties is classified under Compact Article 44C, and its disclosure to non-credentialed parties constitutes a labor violation subject to penalty." I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I put the manual down and started work. The imagery was, at first, exactly what they said it would be. Street-level survey footage of Toronto, captured by the small hexagonal drones that had been a fixture of the skyline for a decade, hovering at about 8 meters, rotating slowly, recording everything. My job was to watch the footage at 1/4 speed and tag any visible brand marks, logos, signage, or trademarked imagery using a simple marking tool that would blur the offending pixels in the final cut. The Hegemony's licensing bureau had deals with approximately none of Earth's surviving corporations and no intention of acquiring any. It was cheaper to blur. I was good at it. Faster than their models expected, I could tell because my supervisor, a low-grade administrative intelligence that communicated through the workstation's text interface, noted my output rate in its first weekly report with what I interpreted as surprise. I was given a secondary flag category, human faces. The Hegemony's privacy protocols, drafted for their own species, technically covered the involuntary broadcast of identifiable biological markers. Faces qualified. I was to blur any face that appeared in the survey footage in a way that might constitute an identifiable record. That was when I started to understand what I was actually looking at. Because the faces were everywhere, and they were not just faces on a street. They were faces of people I recognized not personally, but categorically. A woman outside a drop-in center on Spadina, standing very still in a line that stretched around the block, holding a food token in one hand and a child's drawing in the other, looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite shame and not quite defiance, and was entirely too complicated for me to blur without feeling something. A man on a bicycle on Queen Street with a cargo frame welded to the back, stacked with what looked like handmade prosthetic components, riding in the dedicated drone traffic lane because the bike lanes were gone. 2 teenagers outside a shuttered mall, one of them with a Hegemony labor brand on the back of her left hand, the small phosphorescent mark they gave you when you signed your first contract at 16, the other one without, and something in the space between them that I recognized as the beginning of an argument about what that difference meant. I blurred their faces, I tagged their logos, I moved on. But I kept the transcripts. That was not part of the job. That was a thing I started doing around week 3, when I realized that the audio feed was accessible through a secondary port in the workstation interface that the manual had not mentioned, and that my administrative supervisor had apparently not noticed. The audio was raw, ambient sound from the drones, the same footage I was cleaning visually, mostly traffic, wind. The low-frequency hum the drones made that you stopped hearing after a while the way you stop hearing air conditioning, but sometimes voices. And sometimes the Hegemony commentary track. The commentary was added in post, I understood eventually. A cultural context layer applied to the footage before broadcast, explaining to home cluster audiences what they were seeing. It was delivered in the Hegemony's primary vocalizer register, which sounded to human ears like someone speaking through a comb held over a speaker. I couldn't understand the language directly, but the localization software that ran alongside the survey data translated automatically, and the transcripts came out in English. The first commentary transcript I saved said this: over footage of the Roncesvalles Street Market, where I bought my own food twice a week. The subject population engages in what appears to be a communal resource exchange ritual. Note the informal social cohesion behaviors physical proximity, eye contact duration, vocalization patterns consistent with positive affect. This is notable because economic modeling predicts significantly lower social function at this resource tier. The subjects appear not to have received this information. I read that twice. Then I saved the file to a private partition I had carved out of the workstation's local storage, which the manual had also not mentioned, and which my supervisor had also not found. I kept working. I want to be careful here about the sequence of things because the sequence matters. What I did slowly and without a plan. I was not a hero. I was not a resistance operative. I was a man who worked too many hours in a shipping container and had too much access to things he was not supposed to read, and who had, over the course of several months, accumulated a very clear picture of how the hegemony saw us and what they thought that vision was worth. The picture was this. We were a spectacle. We were the funny, broken thing. We were, in the parlance of their entertainment industry, what they called a soft tragedy format, a category of programming that was ostensibly documentary but functioned emotionally as comedy, presenting subjects whose circumstances should evoke pity but whose behavior repeatedly confounded expectation in ways the audience found amusing. We did not behave like a defeated species. We did not demonstrate the appropriate responses to economic subjugation. We adapted. We improvised. We made jokes. We built things out of other broken things. We loved each other with an intensity that the hegemony's behavioral models flagged as irrational, in conditions that should have made love a luxury no one could afford, and we did it anyway, and their audiences apparently could not get enough of it. Window on the World averaged 400 million viewers per episode across the home clusters. The episode featuring Gary and Karen, a couple in Etobicoke who had converted their apartment into a production line for the articulated infant companions the hegemony's middle class purchased for their offspring, had been the most watched episode of the third season. Not because Gary and Karen were pathetic, which is how the hegemony framed it, but because, according to the commentary transcript I pulled, the audience had developed what the localization software rendered as parasocial investment in the couple's evident affection for each other, which persisted despite labor conditions the commentary described as broadly characteristic of low-tier resource zones. Broadly characteristic of low-tier resource zones. That was how they described what Gary and Karen lived in. A 2-bedroom apartment with a cracked ceiling and a production quota they hit every week, sometimes by sleeping in 4-hour shifts. I pulled Gary and Karen's faces out of the blur queue and put them back. I logged it as a processing error. My supervisor noted the discrepancy. I resubmitted with the blur applied and apologized via text interface for the oversight. Then I kept their faces in a separate file anyway. I am not going to pretend I knew what I was building. Toward the end of the 6th month, when I had 412 hours of raw survey audio, a localization key I had reverse-engineered from the commentary software, and a privately mapped layout of the entire broadcast pipeline from drone capture to home cluster transmission, I still did not have a plan. I had information. And I had, working in the container 2 stations down from me, a woman named Serena who had been hired 6 weeks after me for a different flag category, commercial speech acts, and who had the most comprehensive understanding of hegemony broadcasting infrastructure of anyone I had ever met, because she had spent 3 years working for the Nigerian spam cartel before the compact crackdown and understood, in granular practical detail, exactly how information moved across a network when someone powerful wanted it to stop. Serena was not what you would call warm. She was efficient. She spoke in declarative sentences. She ate lunch alone and read physical books, which she carried in a canvas bag with a broken strap that she had repaired with electrical tape in 3 places. The first time I showed her the transcript files, she read them for 11 minutes without speaking. Then she closed the partition window, handed the workstation back to me and said, "They're broadcasting this live." I said, "What?" She said, "The survey feed, the drone footage, It's not archived and processed, it's live. They're watching us right now, all of us. I thought about that. I thought about Gary and Corinne in Etobicoke, making their quota in 4-hour sleep shifts. I thought about the woman outside the Spadina drop-in center with the child's drawing. I thought about 400 million viewers watching us not die on schedule. I said, what would happen if we could watch them back? Serena looked at me for a moment. Then she said, they'd have to change the show. Let me tell you about Anton and Toph. I knew them because everyone in the labor district eventually knew them. The way you know people who work the same impossible circuit and keep running into each other at the same bottlenecks. They harvested spider silk. That sounds like nothing until you understand what it actually is. The Hegemony's textile manufacturing sector required certain very specific protein fibers for their higher-end production lines, and one of the few things Earth produced at competitive price points was silk protein from the modified spiders that had colonized the underside of every bridge and overpass in southern Ontario since a genetic containment failure in 2031. The spiders were harmless. The work was not dangerous, exactly, but it was cold, and it was solitary, and it required you to spend 6 hours a day suspended from a harness under a bridge with a collection kit. And it paid roughly 60% of minimum labor credit allocation because the Hegemony had classified it as unskilled. Toph was the older brother. Anton was softer, more uncertain, the kind of man who laughed too easily and apologized for things that were not his fault. Toph had been supporting both of them since their parents lost their housing contract, and there was something between them that I recognized without fully understanding, a debt of loyalty that had been carried too long, that had started to warp the shape of both of them. When Toph cut Anton out of the work contract and filed for a single operator permit, citing reduced output from a dual team, I heard about it through the labor registry network. I don't know what happened between them. I know Anton showed up at the container site 3 days later looking for work, any work, and that Serena was the one who handed him a floor mat and a blanket and a cup of water heated on the container's exhaust vent and said, "Sleep here tonight. We'll find something." That was the first time I saw Serena be kind to someone. She looked slightly surprised at herself. We found Anton work blurring road signs the following week. He was not fast, but he was careful, and he had the quality that good janitors have, which is that he noticed things. He noticed, for instance, that the survey footage he was processing contained a recurring anomaly, a set of coordinates near the Bloor Viaduct where the drone footage showed a blank gray expanse that visual analysis tagged as surface damage, but that the audio transcript described, in Hegemony commentary, as a preservation gap. A place where the feed had been deliberately interrupted. He showed me the coordinates. He said, "What's there?" I checked the registry. The coordinates corresponded to a Hegemony archival installation, what the compact called a memory vault, one of several they had established across occupied zones as repositories of pre-contact human culture. Art, literature, architecture, music, linguistic samples. The Hegemony preserved these things the way a collector preserves old coins, as curiosities with assessed value, catalogued, controlled, available for broadcast in retrospective programming about extinct or diminished civilizations. They were broadcasting our past to their people as entertainment. The memory vault near the Bloor Viaduct contained, according to the archival registry, an immersive reconstruction environment, what the translation software rendered as a Wayback Machine, a navigable simulation of human urban life as it had existed prior to contact. You could walk through it, apparently, if you were Hegemony authorized personnel. Anton said, "Can we get in?" I said, "That is an extraordinarily bad idea." He said, "I know, can we get in?" Here is what I have to say about the Hegemony security architecture, based on 6 months of intimate familiarity with their data infrastructure. It was excellent at the things they had thought of. It was entirely blind to the things they had not. They had designed their systems around their own behavioral models, and their behavioral models said that a Category 4 pre-collapse species, economically dependent and legally bound by labor contracts, would not attempt to breach a cultural archive. There was no logical reason to do so. There was no material gain. The risk-reward calculation, run through any standard hegemony analytical framework, produced a clear negative result. They had not adequately modeled spite, or grief, or the specific human experience of standing outside a sealed room full of everything you used to be, and deciding that the seal is not the last word on the matter. Serena built the access protocol in 4 days. She used components she had been quietly assembling for 2 months from her own work queue, fragments of the localization software, a cloned authentication seed from a maintenance drone she had flagged as visual debris, a signal routing map she had constructed from the same transit architecture the spam cartel had used to move product through hegemony-monitored networks. It was, she said, the cleanest piece of work she had ever done. She said it the way a craftsman says it, without pleasure, just recognition. We went in at 300 on a Thursday. Me, Serena, and Anton. We did not tell anyone else. We did not have a plan beyond getting inside. What we found inside the Wayback Machine was Toronto, not the city as it was in 2041, cracked and contracted and reclassified. The city as it had been in 2019, which to me was childhood, before I fully understood what the economic signals meant, before the contraction, before the first hegemony survey ships appeared as bright, slow-moving stars and people made guesses about what they were that turned out to be wrong in every direction. The simulation was perfect. I stood on the corner of Queen and Spadina in digital 2019, and I could smell the coffee from the shop on the corner, which the hegemony had included because smell data had been captured in their environmental survey, and the archivists apparently valued completeness. Anton sat down on a simulated bench and did not speak for a long time. Serena walked 2 blocks north and stood in front of a building that I eventually realized must have been where she grew up, from the way she stood. She didn't say anything about it. She just stood there for a while, and then she turned around and came back, and her face was the face of someone who has received information they already knew but had been keeping at a distance. I was looking at the sky. The 2019 sky, before the survey drones, before the compact satellites. Just the city's light pollution against clouds and the occasional real star punching through. And I was also, because I am who I am, and because 6 months of surveillance work leaves a certain set of instincts, checking the simulation's output architecture. Because the Wayback Machine was not just a storage system. It was a broadcast-ready environment. The same pipeline that carried window on the window to 400 million viewers across the home clusters ran through this installation. The hegemony had built the archive to be broadcastable. It was a content asset. They could, at any moment, run a retrospective episode. Here is what Earth was before. And pipe it live to the audience that had spent 3 seasons watching us not die correctly in the ruins. I thought about the 400 million viewers who had watched Gary and Corinne sleep in shifts to make their quota. I thought about what those viewers thought we were. I thought about what it might do to that audience to see, live and unmediated, what we had been. Not the broken version, the version before. The sky without drones. The city with its lights on. I said, Serena, can you flip the feed? She said, flip it how? I said, I want to broadcast out of here, not to us, to them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you mean take over the window on the world slot? I said, yes. She said, that's a labor violation under 12 separate compact articles. I said, yes. She said, they'll identify the source in about 40 minutes and shut it down. I said, how much can we push through in 40 minutes? She looked at me. Then she looked at Anton, who was still sitting on the bench, watching digital 2019 people walk past him on a street that no longer quite existed. Then she sat down at the access node and said, let's find out. What we broadcast, in 37 minutes before the hegemony's content security division locked the feed, was not a manifesto. It was not a message. We had no time for messages. What we broadcast was the Wayback Machine, navigable, raw, unfiltered, piped directly into the window on the world transmission slot, replacing the scheduled episode with the Hegemony's own archive of our own past, sent back to the audience that had been watching us fail for 3 seasons. I cannot tell you what 400 million people experienced. I can only tell you what I experienced, running the feed from inside the simulation while Serena managed the transmission architecture and Anton, without being asked, started walking. He walked through Digital 2019 Toronto and he talked, quietly, into the ambient audio pickup. Not at anyone, just talking. The way a man talks when he has not been able to say something for too long. He talked about the bridge, about the hours under the bridge with the collection kit, about what the silk caught the light like in the morning before the drone shift started, when the sun came low and the webs held it, and the whole underside of the Bloor Viaduct looked like it had been built for the purpose. He talked about Toph, about what it was like to love someone who had taught you everything and had also slowly, over years, decided you were a liability. He talked about the building he'd grown up in, which was 2 blocks from where we were standing in the simulation. He said, "It's still there. The physical building is still there. The Hegemony licensed it for worker housing. There are 40 families in it now." He said, "We didn't go anywhere. We're still here." I do not know how that translated. The localization software was running on the broadcast feed. I know that the same software that had been rendering our world in Hegemony terms for their audience for 3 seasons, now running in reverse, rendering a human man's voice into something the home cluster audience could process. I do not know if Anton's words came through. I do not know if the 2019 sky came through. I do not know if what they saw was grief or defiance, or just a man on a bench talking to the air, while an illegal broadcast burned through their entertainment feed. I know the feed ran for 37 minutes. I know the content security lockdown, when it came, was faster than any previous enforcement action in the Toronto Labor District, which meant someone upstream had noticed. Someone had been watching. I know that in the 48 hours after the broadcast, the window on the world comment infrastructure, which Serena had been quietly monitoring through a secondary mirror she had set up 4 weeks earlier, having apparently already thought of this possibility, showed a pattern shift that the localization software characterized as an increase in what it called reflective inquiry vocalization. Hegemony viewers asking questions, not about us, about themselves, about what they looked like from the outside. The labor registry called me in the following morning. The administrative supervisor who had been monitoring my output for 6 months was not present. In its place was a Hegemony official whose rank insignia I did not recognize and who communicated through a much better translation interface. Real-time, nuanced, clearly built for negotiation rather than compliance management. The official said, "You understand that what you did constitutes a significant violation?" I said, "Yes." The official said, "You understand the penalties are substantial?" I said, "Yes." The official said, "The Compact Review Board has asked us to determine whether the broadcast was a content act or a security act. The distinction affects the classification." I said, "It was a content act." The official looked at me for a long time. In Hegemony terms, that look is a form of processing, a pause for data integration that their behavioral models use when a result has come in that does not match the prediction. I had learned to read it in the transcripts. I had seen it applied to Gary and Karen when they kept smiling at each other despite the labor data. I had seen it applied to the woman at the drop-in center with the drawing. I had seen it applied to Anton and Toph in the bridge footage, in the early morning light. The official said, "The review board has also noted that the broadcast generated significant audience response metrics." I said nothing. The official said, "There is a proposal to reclassify the broadcast as a user-generated content event under the existing window on the World Licensing Framework. This would convert the violation to a contractual irregularity. The penalty would be a credit fine and a revised contract. I said, "What does revised mean?" The official said, "Access to the archive, supervised, scheduled, with production input rights." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the container, I could hear the morning, traffic on the Gardiner, a food cart with a bad bearing on its wheel, grinding slightly as it moved. Two people arguing about something in the building across the street, their voices carrying in that flat air way they do before full humidity sets in, the words too far to make out but the shape of the argument familiar, the cadence of people who know each other very well working through something that matters. The Hegemony official was waiting. I said, "I want Serena and Anton included, same contract." The official said, "That's possible." I said, "And Gary and Karen, I have their coordinates, put them in the production rotation." The official processed this, then said, "The review board indicated a broader survey might be considered." I said, "Good. There's a lot of Toronto left that your drones haven't found the right angles on." The official did something with its sensory cluster that the localization software rendered, somewhat uncertainly, as acknowledgement. Then it processed the paperwork and left. I sat in the container for a while after it was gone. The workstation was still running. My queue was full, 400 images waiting for logos to blur, faces to anonymize, the daily business of cleaning someone else's view of our world. I looked at the queue. Then I minimized it and opened the transcript archive instead. Everything I had saved over 6 months, 412 hours of their commentary on us, their curiosity about why we wouldn't break the way things were supposed to break. I thought about what Serena had said, standing in front of that building in the simulation. She hadn't said anything, actually, just stood there. That was the thing they'd never gotten right in all their modeling. They kept looking for our message, our manifesto, our organized response. They kept trying to locate the strategy in what we did. The review board wanted to know if the broadcast was a content act or a security act, as if those were the only two categories available, as if a man talking to himself on a simulated bench about morning light under a bridge had a classification. We were not strategic. We were not organized. We were just very, very hard to humiliate thoroughly enough to stop. In the months after the contract revision, window on the world changed. I cannot take credit for that, or rather, I can take credit for starting a thing whose direction none of us controlled. The production input rights meant we were consulted loosely on what the drones filmed and how it was contextualized. The commentary changed. Still hegemony commentary, still translated, still aimed at an audience that had never seen Earth before the contact era, but different in register. Less soft tragedy. More, the localization software kept trying different words and kept settling on curious. As if we were a question they had asked and then discovered was harder than it looked. The memory vault access continued. We ran 3 more broadcasts from the Wayback Machine in the first year, all contracted, all supervised, all logged. Anton became, unexpectedly, the one the audience latched onto, his voice, the particular way he talked about ordinary things as if they were worth the attention, translated across the home clusters in a way that neither Serena nor I could entirely explain. He got letters. Hegemony letters, routed through the Compact Communication Bureau, translated by the same localization software, full of that reflective inquiry vocalization. Viewers asking him what they were looking at, asking him to explain the morning light on the web silk, asking him why he kept going back under the bridge after his brother cut the contract. He answered everyone. He was careful with them the way he had been careful with the road signs. He said, "Because the light's different every day. Because I've been doing it long enough that the spiders don't react to me anymore. Because it's mine, even though nothing official says so. Because no one can make me not notice it." That last one got quoted in a home cluster cultural commentary publication, according to Serena's monitoring. The localization software was uncertain about the full context, but the rough translation was, "The ghost said this is mine. The ghost said no one can make me not notice it." I don't know what they made of that. I don't know what it means to be called a ghost by something that was trying to watch you disappear. I know what the morning looks like now, from my station on the west edge of what used to be Parkdale. The drones are still there, they never went away. The contract revision changed their access parameters, not their presence. But the footage they capture goes now through a production pipeline we're part of, with a commentary layer that has to at minimum be reviewed by a human translator before it ships, which creates a 2-hour window in which someone on our end reads what's being said about us before it goes out. I read every transcript, old habit. Last week's footage included a segment on Toph, who had taken on a secondary labor contract hauling water filtration units for a Hegemony processing installation north of the city. He was good at it, apparently. The drones had caught him in the early morning, hoisting a unit onto a transit frame, and the commentary had flagged it as characteristic adaptive behavior, which is the Hegemony's way of saying, look at this creature doing what it does, still doing it. I blurred the brand on the transit frame because that's still my job. I left his face. The debt is still there. The labor registry is still there. The city is still patched together with what's available, which is what it has always been, if I'm being honest about the history. None of that changed, and I'm not going to tell you it did, because the men who watch this story back home will know when you're lying to them about the cost of things. But the feed goes 2 ways now. That's not nothing. They sent a camera to document how we work. What they got was us looking back. I don't think they've finished processing that yet. Some mornings early, before the drone shift and before the heat comes up, I walk down to the Bloor Viaduct. Not for any work reason, just to walk. The modified spiders have been at it all night, and the silk catches the horizontal light in a way that is, whatever anyone says about utility or resource value or labor credit allocation, genuinely beautiful. It's there whether you see it or not. It was there before the Hegemony catalogued it. It will be there after whatever comes next. Anton told me once that the spiders don't react to him anymore because he's been there long enough to become part of the environment. He said, that's all you have to do, just be there long enough. I think about that when I read the transcripts. I think about 400 million people watching us not stop. I think about what it must look like from that distance, to watch a species that keeps finding the light even in the architecture of its own defeat, that keeps saying this is mine about things that technically aren't, that keeps insisting on the specific weight and texture of its own existence, even when every practical signal says the insistence is irrational. I think good. Let them watch. We're still here. I should tell you about the night Serena, and I ran the diagnostic on the full broadcast pipeline, 2 weeks before we went into the Wayback Machine. We were in the container past midnight, which was not unusual. Neither of us slept well in those months, and work was easier than lying in the dark thinking about the debt figures. The workstation had been throwing a retrieval error on a specific survey segment from the junction area, and Serena had been tracing the error backward through the pipeline to find where the data had degraded. She found it at the Hegemony's regional relay node, a hardware installation in a repurposed telecom facility on Kiel, about which we knew almost nothing officially. But the pipeline map she had been building for months told a fuller story. The relay node was not just a data pass-through. It was a compression and annotation station, where raw survey footage was flagged for human interest potential and routed to the window on the world production team. There was a human interest scoring algorithm. It evaluated footage against a set of parameters the Hegemony production team had developed over 3 seasons, and it flagged the highest scoring material for priority broadcast. Serena pulled the parameter list. She read it in silence for a long time. Then she said, "Do you want to know what they score highest?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "Subjects demonstrating unexpected positive affect in low resource conditions. subjects demonstrating what the algorithm classifies as irrational persistence, continuing to pursue an activity or relationship beyond the point at which modeling predicts abandonment. Subjects demonstrating what the algorithm classifies as humor response, vocalization, or behavioral indicators of amusement in the presence of negative stimuli. I said, so they're selecting for people who won't quit and keep laughing about it. She said, they think that's the funny part. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the drones moved in their steady rotation. Somewhere to the north, under the viaduct, the spiders were working in the dark the way they worked all night, building their silk across the cold architecture of the bridge, patient and constant, and utterly indifferent to the surveillance above them. I said, what's the highest scoring segment in the archive? She checked. Then she laughed, the first time I had heard Serena actually laugh, sharp and brief like a door closing. She said, a 7-minute segment from a Tuesday morning 2 years ago, a man repairing a streetcar that hasn't run in 11 years. He had apparently sourced the parts himself over a 2-year period, and he was working in the rain, and he had a thermos, and he was singing. I said, did it work, the streetcar? She said, the data doesn't go that far. The drone moved on. I thought about that man a lot in the days after. I still think about him. Not because it's a triumph. I don't know if the streetcar ever ran. I think about him because of the thermos, because of the singing. Because someone thought, on a Tuesday morning in the rain, that this broken thing was worth the 2 years it had taken to gather the parts, and nobody had told him to do it, and nobody was paying him for it, and the Hegemony's algorithm had flagged it as irrational persistence and highest human interest potential, which meant 400 million viewers had watched a man fix a streetcar in the rain and found it, apparently. The most interesting thing we had done in 2 years of continuous surveillance. The algorithm was right. That was the thing. The algorithm was looking for the right thing for the wrong reasons. It was looking for us being funny. What it kept finding was us being stubborn and careful and attached to things that didn't make economic sense to be attached to. And it kept flagging that as entertainment. And maybe somewhere in the home clusters, in the 140 viewing sessions and the reflective inquiry vocalizations, and the letters to Anton about morning light on silk, something had started to shift. We were not a tragedy. We were not a comedy. We were a species that fixed streetcars in the rain and sang while we did it, and if you watched long enough and honestly enough, something in that was going to be harder to look away from than you expected. The official who came after the broadcast told me before she left that the review board had noted one additional item. The 37-minute Wayback Machine broadcast had been the highest rated window on the world segment in the show's 4-year history. Not in its market tier. Across the entire home cluster broadcast network, all formats, all genres. The most watched thing that month in 11-star systems was an illegal transmission of a city that doesn't quite exist anymore, and a man on a bench talking quietly about a bridge. She told me this the way you tell someone a fact whose implications you are still working out. Then she filed the paperwork and left. I went back to the container. I sat down at the workstation. I opened the queue. 467 images. Logos to blur, faces to protect, the long, ordinary work of cleaning someone else's record of us. I started at the top. Outside, Toronto ran its morning. The food cart with the bad wheel. The argument that was really a conversation. The drones at 8 meters, rotating. The sky the same sky it had always been. A particular shade of early morning gray that the color calibration in the Hegemony survey drones slightly misrepresented. They rendered it 2 shades cooler than it actually was. A minor calibration error I had noted in month 2 and flagged and been told was within acceptable parameters. It was not within acceptable parameters. I knew what the sky looked like. I had grown up under it. I put a note in the calibration file, not a formal complaint, just a note. Color rendering does not accurately represent subject environment. Please advise. They never replied. The drones kept rendering the sky 2 shades too cool. But I kept putting the notes in. That's all really. That's the whole thing. No fleet. No weapon. No moment where we looked at the odds and decided to be brave in the way stories usually require. Just a digital janitor in a shipping container, reading files he wasn't supposed to read, and a woman who knew how information moved, and a man who talked to strangers about bridge light, and 400 million people in 11 star systems who watched us longer than they intended to and found themselves, at the end, not quite sure who the show was about. We kept their records, we read their transcripts, we learned their pipeline, and we ran a transmission through it that was nothing more and nothing less than, here is what we were, here is what we still are. And we went back to work the next morning. Because that's the thing about us. We always go back to work the next morning, not because we're not tired, not because it doesn't cost, but because the alternative is letting them write the only version of the story, and we have never, in all our complicated and irrational history, been willing to do that. The sky was the wrong color in their footage. I kept putting notes in. I knew what I was looking at. I want to go back for a moment to Corinne. Not Gary. Gary gets told in the story easily enough, because Gary was the one who talked, who explained the work to the drones with the patient exhaustion of a man who had explained it many times and had made peace with the explaining. But Corinne was the one who knew the drones were there first. I know this because I had watched the footage, hours of it, before I understood the show. I had watched Corinne assembling the infant companions on the workbench in their second bedroom, and I had watched the way her hands moved, which was fast and certain, and I had watched the moment, in a footage segment from about 14 months in, when she paused mid-assembly and looked directly at the survey drone hovering in the corner of the room near the ceiling. She looked at it for about 4 seconds, then she went back to work. She never told Gary, or if she did, it wasn't on the footage I had. She just knew the drone was there, knew what it was doing. And she made a choice that I didn't fully understand at the time, which was to keep going anyway, to keep doing the work the way she had always done it, with the same movements and the same quiet efficiency, the same pauses where she checked the fit on the joints before moving to the next component. I thought about that choice for a long time. I thought about what it meant to know you were being watched and decide that the watching didn't change what you were doing. I think it was the most principled thing I saw anyone do in those years. Not the broadcast, not Serena's pipeline work, which was brilliant, not Anton's letters, which were honest, but Corinne, at a workbench in Etobicoke, looking at the surveillance drone in her own home, and then looking away and continuing. She wasn't performing, she wasn't ignoring it. She was saying, with 4 seconds of direct eye contact and then the return to work, this is what I do. This is what I am. Whatever you think you're seeing, this is the actual thing. I never got to tell Corinne that. The production input rights came through the compact bureaucracy, and by the time we had an official contact protocol, she and Gary had moved, relocated to a larger unit in Scarborough when the Hegemony's baby companion division expanded their quota and increased the labor credit rate for a full production household. Last I heard through the registry network, they had 2 more assembly workers contracted to them, both living in the unit, and the production line was running 3 shifts. Which is either an improvement or it isn't, depending on what you're measuring. The labor credit rate was better. The debt was still there. It's always still there. But the drone in their new unit, I am told, gets looked at directly about once a week. Just a glance, 4 seconds. Then back to work. I heard that from Anton, who heard it from someone else, the way you hear most things that matter in a labor district. Sideways, second-hand, in the specific register of information that moves because people decided it was worth the trouble to move it. He told me like it was a small thing, like it was just a fact about Corinne. I have been thinking about it for 2 years. There is a version of this story where we won, where the broadcast changed something fundamental, where the compact restructured its labor practices, where the debt forgiveness program the review board floated in year 2 actually materialized in year 3. That version exists somewhere, I think. Someone will tell it eventually, and they will not be wrong to tell it. But the version I lived was quieter than that. The version I lived was the workstation and the queue and the calibration notes that never got answered, and Serena reading her physical books at lunch with her repaired canvas bag, and Anton's letters going out one by one to 11-star systems, and Corinne at her workbench in Scarborough meeting the drone's eye once a week and looking away. We did not get free. We got seen differently, which is not the same thing, but is also not nothing. 400 million people in 11-star systems watched 37 minutes of what we used to be, and then they watched us go back to work the next morning, and somewhere in that watching, something shifted. What it meant to call us ghosts, what it meant to look at us and expect to see something broken and instead keep seeing something else. Something that noticed the light, something that fixed things, something that talked about bridges. The hegemony called us ghosts because we were supposed to be gone. Because the version of events that made sense to them ended with us diminished past the point of mattering, transparent, moving through the edges of their world without casting a shadow. They were wrong about that. We cast a shadow, we always have, and we know how to read the light that makes it, even when the drones render it 2 shades too cool. The debt is still there. The registry is still there. The morning is still the same color it was before any of this. I go in every day, I open the queue, I read the transcripts. I know what I'm looking at. There is something I did not tell the review board. In the 48 hours after the broadcast, while Serena was monitoring the home cluster commentary infrastructure, and Anton was writing the first of his letters, I went back into the access logs from the Wayback Machine installation. I had maintained a copy of the authentication seed, which technically I should have discarded per the terms of the labor violation settlement. I did not discard it. I am telling you this now because the statute of limitations on that particular compact provision has since expired, and because it matters to the story. What I found in the access logs was this. The Wayback Machine had not been accessed only by us. In the 72 hours before our entry, there had been 3 separate access events from a Hegemony credentialed account registered to the Content Security Division. Someone on the official side had been in the archive. Not for production purposes, the account had no production flags. The access had lasted between 4 and 9 minutes each time, which is long enough to walk through a simulated street, but not long enough to run a full content audit. Someone from the Hegemony's Content Security Division had been visiting the simulation of 2019 Toronto 3 times in the week before we broke in. I have thought about what that means. I have not come to a conclusion that I am fully confident in, but the most straightforward reading is that someone in the apparatus that was supposed to be watching us had, at some point, started watching something else, had started going back to look at what was in the archive, had found something in there worth returning to. I do not know who that person was. I do not know what they were looking at. Maybe the sky, maybe a building, maybe a street market with people standing too close together, demonstrating social cohesion behaviors that the economic model said should not be present at that resource tier. I like to think it was the streetcar man. I like to think someone in a monitoring station on the other side of a very large distance had been watching a man fix a broken thing in the rain and hadn't been able to stop thinking about it, hadn't been able to stop going back to look at it again. That is, I recognize, a sentimental reading. I am allowed to be sentimental about this one thing. The access logs are gone now, wiped in the post-broadcast cleanup. I saved a transcript of them the same way I had saved everything else, in a partition no one thought to look for, on a workstation in a shipping container on the west edge of what used to be Parkdale. I still have it, I look at it sometimes. There were 3 visits, 4 minutes, 7 minutes, 9 minutes. The last one 9 minutes was at 3:40 in the morning, which is deep night in the Toronto time zone, and which would have been, depending on the home cluster origin of the access account, some version of the middle of someone's working day. Someone worked late looking at our city. Someone from the apparatus that was supposed to be managing us spent 9 minutes at 3:40 walking through a simulation of what we used to be. I keep that alongside the calibration notes. All the things I said and no one answered. All the notes I put in the file about the sky being the wrong color, about the footage misrepresenting the quality of the morning light, about the gap between what the Hegemony's instruments measured and what the place actually was. They never replied to those notes, but someone read them. The access logs told me that much too. My calibration files had been accessed twice by the same content security account, just the files. No action taken, no correction made to the color rendering, just opened, read. The sky in the footage is still 2 shades too cool. I still put notes in. What I understand now that I did not understand in year 1 is that the show was always going in both directions. They thought they were studying us. Their instruments were present, their data was real, their transmission pipeline was genuine. But the act of watching, sustained across 4 years and 400 million viewers, is not a one-directional thing. You cannot watch something carefully for that long without it changing what you see when you look elsewhere. You cannot spend that much time with something that behaves unexpectedly, that keeps finding things to value in conditions your models say should preclude valuation, and come away with your original categories intact. We did not defeat the hegemony. I want to be clear about that because someone will imply otherwise, and that is not what happened, and it is not the point. The labor contracts are still running. The debt instruments are still compounding. The drones are still at 8 meters. But the show changed. The commentary changed. The scoring algorithm was revised twice in the 2 years after the broadcast. I know because I have access to the production pipeline now, supervised and logged, and the revision documents came through the same feed I read every day. The first revision added a new parameter, extended persistence without observable deterioration in affect. The second revision added evidence of maintained interpersonal investment in high-constraint conditions. The algorithm, in other words, stopped looking for the funny part and started looking for the other part. The part that wasn't what they expected. The part that didn't fit the model. The ratings went up. I don't know what to do with that entirely. I know that being more interesting to 400 million viewers is not the same as being free. I know that the calibration of the drones has not changed, and my notes are still unanswered. I know that Anton's letters have made him, in some home cluster markets, a recognizable figure in a way that has not yet translated to any material change in his labor contract. Though his credit rating has improved, and the registry stopped flagging him as a single operator risk after his viewer correspondence numbers were included in his file. Apparently, the Compact's labor registry has a field for public interest designation that no one in the Toronto district had ever seen activated before. He didn't know what it meant when it appeared on his file. He came to me and showed me the notation and said, "What is this?" I said, "I think it means you matter to enough people that it got logged." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does it help with the debt?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Okay," and went back to his letters. That is Anton. That is entirely Anton. He asked the practical question, received a practical answer, and went back to the work. No speech about it, no moment of symbolic weight, just, okay, and then the next thing. I have tried to explain to people who weren't there why that was one of the more affecting things I witnessed in those years. I'm not sure I can. You had to be in the container. You had to have read the transcripts, seen the commentary, understood how hard the hegemony had tried to make us legible to their categories. Broken, amusing, tragically persistent, irrational in our continued attachment to things that held no strategic value. And then you had to watch Anton process the information that he mattered to enough people in 11-star systems to get a field activated on a labor registry form, and say, okay, and go write another letter about morning light on silk. That is what they couldn't model. That is what keeps not fitting in the algorithm no matter how many times they revise it. It's not the persistence exactly. It's that the persistence is not about them. It was never about them. We were not persisting in spite of the hegemony as a form of defiance, as a statement. We were persisting because there are things worth doing that have nothing to do with who's watching and what they think about it. The spiders build their webs in the dark under the bridge. They don't know about the light they'll catch in the morning. They build because that is what they do, and the light happens to them as a consequence, and it is beautiful as a consequence, and neither of those things was the point. We are a little like that, I think, or I am at least. I go in every day. I open the queue. I read the transcripts. I put notes in files that no one answers. I know what I'm looking at. I go back tomorrow.